Hello everybody, welcome back to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about the Atari Landfill. So let's begin. On September 26, 1983, Atari buried roughly 700,000 video games, along with who knows how many consoles, computers, and various other things that they had developed in a massive landfill just outside of the town of Alamogordo, New Mexico. Now, for many years, it was believed this was simply an urban legend, and many people didn't believe it. But it turned out to be true after it was unearthed on April 26, 2014, when it was excavated with the help of the New Mexican government as part of a documentary known as Game Over. This documentary talked about the video game crash in 1983, and of course talked about the Atari Landfill urban legend. Now, this documentary was released onto Xbox Live later on in 2014. Now, as part of the urban legend, it stated that the unsold cartridges of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a notoriously bad game and a massive flop, and the many return cartridges of Pac-Man, which we discussed previously last episode, were also buried there. Now, these turned out to be true. Many copies of these were buried there in the landfill, but many other games that you wouldn't expect it to be buried were buried there, alongside a variety of other things that they had produced, such as their 8-bit computers. But exactly why did they bury it? Well, you see, 1983 had been a very rough year for Atari, as in 1983, Atari had lost $536 million, and in 1984, they were sold off by Warner Communications, the company that bought them out back in 1976. And this had begun even back in late 1982, as reports from late 1982 in December showed that things weren't going their way, and that their growth of expectations didn't reach what they were planning on, as they had expected it to be much larger than what they actually had, as they had a 10 to 15 increase in profits, which was far below what they had intended, and it all really began in 1982, and from 1983, things went down and down for them, as with massive failures such as the Pac-Man game, as they made more copies of Pac-Man than there were Atari consoles sold at the time. They had many unsold consoles, and during that period of time, they were massively downsizing. As one former employee gives an example of how one cubicle of a person, empty cubicle, not a person, and how basically they massively downsized and laid off people en masse because of how big the losses were for Atari in that year, and so they desperately needed to get rid of the remaining stock they had in supply. Yeah, and so buried possibly over maybe even who knows how many under there. But despite the fact that newspapers reported on the incident, it was still believed to be a rumor for many decades up until 2014, despite local newspapers reporting on it. And according to local newspapers, the local children would go to the landfill and try and get games from it, as they would be able to find ways to pull out Atari games and general stuff like that from the landfill. Though eventually this act was stopped, as they didn't want the children, getting hurt or whatever. And from what I've seen, some people also in the local area seem to not very much dislike the idea of burying so much in a massive landfill. But for a little over 30 years, buried in the Mexican desert was 700,000 video game cartridges, many of which were E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Pac-Man, don't get me wrong, but not all of them. There were actually a lot of games in there, as they just needed to get rid of it, mostly Pac-Man games, because there was so many Pac-Man games. And of course, E.T. was a massive failure, just how horrible it was, as they had expected it to be a big hit like their previous game, Raiders of the Lost Ark, based off of the Steven Spielberg movie. And they had paid a lot of money to get the rights to the game. And, well, it was most likely bad because they only had about 6 weeks or so to make it, and it was made just by one guy. And he was really, really ambitious, but he just couldn't do what he wanted to do in that time period. And it was just too complex for gamers' minds in 1983. As most people, they were used to shoot 'em ups, But this game required you to read through the manual all the way through so you could figure out what's going on. But without it, you didn't know what was happening. And this led to being critically panned. and being blamed for the video game crash in 1983. Now, not all of the games were excavated from it, as they only had one singular day to excavate as much as they could. Now, some of these games that were collected from the excavation were sold off, and some of them were also sent to museums. But since there was only one day of excavation, that means there probably still are many, many, many games and consoles and computer systems, because Atari made computer systems, buried out there in the New Mexican desert. As again, they only had about a day to dig as much. Though again, they were able to dig up a lot because, of course, they're very, very small, and sold off at auction or sent it to museums. But so maybe so there might still be some games that lying out there. I don't know if they're playable or not, because from reports seem that I don't know if they're playable or not. But I mean, you could try. But that's all I gotta say today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'll see y'all sometime in the future. So bye. Have a nice time.